when Beyonce enriches herself off of ballroom culture, which has liberated and comforted queer people for decades, and eludes them into believing that she cares about them, that she cares about their struggles, and then gets on a plane and flies to the UAE, where she makes millions of dollars performing for people who do not care about queer people, who actively prop up a regime that denies them their identity, that degrades their rights. And when she, in doing so, decides that that is okay and acceptable as long as it is profitable to her, there is a principled harm to the fans that she has enriched herself off of, but there is also a massive practical trade-off that she inherently loses access to, that she cannot now make change over. What am I going to do for you in this speech? Firstly, a couple of quick points in setup, then 2 substantive contributions. The first is on why these artists have an obligation to their fans that is not upheld when they perform in these jurisdictions. The second is on how we massively enhance these artists' already huge capacity to make change and to improve queer rights internationally. First of all, in setup, what does it look like when a jurisdiction has a lack of queer rights? We think that this is stuff like jurisdictions that engage in massive human rights abuses against LGBT people. These are places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Uganda, but also just a refusal to recognize their identity. Note that currently, in a lot of these jurisdictions, anti-LGBT sentiment and legislation is on a backwards trend. That is to say, things are actively getting worse and degrading as time goes on. Additionally, we think that this looks like jurisdictions that have high levels of homophobic violence that is not actively policed. Note crucially, this does not mean that you cannot perform anywhere, and this doesn't even mean that you could only perform in Australia or Canada. There were lots of jurisdictions around the world that actually did have some level of protection or recognition for LGBT people. Note, for example, Nepal recognizes non-binary people on their census and does have active legal protections for them. So this is not just a debate where we're talking about whether artists should be allowed to perform in any developing country. We're talking about whether artists should be able to perform in jurisdictions that are actively anti-LGBT in their policy and in their law enforcement. Second point of setup, which artists are we talking about? We would note that the topic necessitates that these artists have to have some level of choice over where they perform and have some degree of large following. Notably then, these artists were often people who were not always openly queer, often many of them were openly straight but were actively allied, or they catered their music towards queer people to some extent, or in a lot of cases perhaps they were openly queer. Note crucially that a lot of the time these artists deliberately cultivate queer audiences because they're allied towards queer people and they care about them, but that this allyship and this cultivation directly means that they profit off of those queer people and that queer audience a lot of the time. Secondly then, under these artists, note that we still enable people some level of visibility. We would just like to point out the vast majority of people, queer or otherwise, will never see their favorite artist perform live. You could still absolutely access this artist's art and work via things like YouTube and streaming services. This was not a right that anyone had. First substantive contribution then, on the obligation to fans. We think that artists have a principled obligation to their fans for a bunch of reasons. The first reason is that producing art is something that millions of people do, but only a very small amount of people ever get rich enough to become professional musicians or professional artists. At that point, that means that your fame was inherently reliant on lots of people giving you money. It was a privilege to be enriched by your fans, and therefore you did have a principled obligation to them. Secondly, because a lot of the time, stan culture that was often particularly active in queer communities, this was things like, really supporting an artist, really loving them, actively amplified that enrichment and amplified the level of fame and success you were able to get off of your fans because they loved you, because they were likely to support you whatever you did, because they were likely to do things like mass tweet whenever you dropped an album. Thirdly, because you were actively enriched off of queer communities, because often these artists had deliberately accessed their imagery and their culture in a way that was enriching. This was things like Beyonce's most recent Renaissance album, heavily pulling from ballroom and Vogue culture. This was things like Harry Styles doing coming out videos for his fans and coming out announcements at his concerts, which are often a point of deliberate fan engagement that seek to actively enrich those artists more. Fourth, because often your engagement with these queer communities enabled you to virtue signal through them. We would point to artists like Taylor Swift and Harry Styles often being massively amplified within traditional media because of their allyship to the queer community and being held up as beacons of allyship and engagement. That was really important because it actively enriched these artists. It made them seem more normatively good. Why do you not meet this obligation when you perform in these areas? Firstly, because you turn a blind eye to the regime's worst actions against those queer fans when you perform there. there. But secondly, and this is particularly important, just because you materially supported the regime when you performed there, you were likely to do things like massively drive up the amount of people who were staying in hotels in certain cities, who were buying goods and services, you were massively enriching their tax revenue, you were boosting their economy. Note Sweden literally has been purported to be pulled out of recession because Beyonce performed there recently. You had huge material impact on these places' economies. Why then did you better meet this obligation when you didn't perform there? Firstly, because it was incredibly validating for queer people who were massively devalidated every single day, who were devalidated and dehumanized in their own countries, but also devalidated by Western queer media that did not focus on the kinds of things that they were being subjected to every single day. When your absolute hero said that the way that you were treated in your home country was not acceptable, and that they were willing to take an economic hit in order to not support that regime. Even if it didn't lead to a change within that country, the comfort that that brought you, the visibility that they could bring to your cause was hugely internally validating, and that was really, really important. No, this was an impact that was amplified because of your relationship with that celebrity. That was huge for you. But secondly, because you just enabled a bunch of practical harms to your fans when you performed within these areas. Firstly, there was huge danger in being exposed as queer in a lot of these jurisdictions, and you were uniquely likely to present as such if you were someone who was, attending a concert and who was dressed in a certain way, and therefore was likely to present as queer. Secondly, because attendance just meant that you were exposed in a way that you might not otherwise be. That was to say that you were at much greater risk as a gay man attending a Beyonce concert of people hanging around outside and waiting for people to leave, or of being potentially exposed to hate crime or to slur on your way home. And crucially, because you had limited rights within these countries, you had significantly limited recourse. No, this was particularly important because this was something that was likely to happen uniquely when you were at concerts, because your love for this artist was likely to transcend your capacity to ascertain risk. Second substantive contribution then, why we massively increased these artists' capacity to make change. Firstly, you couldn't make change currently because when you performed, you rainbow washed these jurisdictions, but even if you didn't believe that was true, just because your presence eluded people into believing that this jurisdiction was probably a fair bit better than it was, because if Taylor Swift, a gay rights activist, thought that it was okay to perform in the UAE, then probably the UAE wasn't that bad. The impact of this was that practically states just continued profiting even when they were doing massively harmful things, but secondly, it decreased your capacity to criticize those regimes because now you were perceived as hypocritical, particularly by global media if you then tried to call them out. What do we change? Firstly, we just thought these celebrities had a massive capacity to attract attention to these issues because they had a really high profile, because they were incredibly palatable. That meant that they could do things like name the specific legislation that they opposed that meant that they were not going to perform. Secondly, it meant they had unique PR access. If Taylor Swift posts an Instagram photo where she says the Philippines tour is cancelled because of this piece of legislation, that was huge. That was likely to engender literal millions, possibly billions of people talking about it, and that meant you got heaps of attention onto that issue. That had a bunch of downstream consequences, like you got massive media attention, you got NGO condemnation, you empowered other condemnation, and you massively validated the queer movement. We were the side that enabled you to fulfill your principled obligation and to practically get change, vote out.
Setup, rebuttal, and two arguments. To start with setup, we would use our counter-fiat in this policy debate to have these artists do things like donate a portion of the profit from the tour to queer charities, raise awareness on social media for the local activist causes of the countries or places that they're visiting, and be very supportive of the queer community in all the messaging, branding, and advertising for the tour. That set of things we think ameliorates a huge number of the harms, particularly the principal harms, this team tries to highlight, but we're also going to explain why these things are actively practically beneficial. I'll just note here, to the extent that the host does not agree or approve with any of the actions that we've said that these artists will do. Firstly, many of these things do not require the approval of the host. For instance, what you do with your profit or how you use your social media is unlikely to be governed by like the UAE just because you're going on a tour there. And we'd also point out that these artists tend to have plenty of bargaining power because they have a limited commodity, which is fame, prestige, the ability to kind of bring Western eyes to a particular event, meaning we're likely to be able to do these things. The only other thing I want to note in setup is the characterization of scope this team sets up kind of clashes with the motion. Like their contention is that we're only going to restrict like kind of performance in places where violence is being actively perpetuated and stuff like that, which seems to clash pretty clearly with the example of a place like Texas, in particular the cities where these artists tend to perform, places like Austin, places like Dallas. So really what this team needs to stand behind is restriction in a far broader set of cases. That is the set of cases where legislation at a higher level might prohibit some form of access to healthcare or prohibit some form of expression, but not places exclusively where things are that bad. But next thing we're going to do in this speech is deal with their principle. It has two parts. Firstly, you have an obligation to your queer fans, and secondly, you breach it. Why does this obligation not exist? They only give you three reasons for this obligation. The first is you've profited from your fans, but it's very unclear that extends to an additional obligation. In exchange for that profit, you gave your fans the art that they're listening to. You gave them the experiences that they enjoy by listening to your music. That is the exchange of goods and services. That is the exchange of rights and obligations. It's unclear just because you sell someone a product, you then have an obligation to their political interests writ large. Secondly, they say privilege. Very unclear why this on its own endows the artist with such a specific obligation to cater towards a very particular political need. This is just privilege, privilege, privilege in a social justice debate, not analysis. And thirdly, they say, well, stands support you, so you have an obligation to your stands, which is just ridiculous. This is a decision made by the stands to get around you. You do not consent to having these stands. You do not enlist these people for their labor. Just because these people support you, you do not owe them an obligation if you have not agreed to receive that support in exchange for something else. The obligation doesn't exist. But then they say, well, you breached this obligation because you enriched the oppressor. Firstly, drop in the ocean for a country like the UAE compared to stuff like oil and other commodities. But also would note that you're only really enriching the venue, like the stadium, and the hotels. Very unclear what connection there is between a venue and hotels and oppression of queer people. No obligation, no breach, their case falls right away. Two arguments then in this speech. Firstly, on why this is very bad for the fans of the countries that now miss out. The context I want to add here is this first affirmative speaker opens their speech by saying, you are now performing for the oppressor. No, you're performing for queer people in these countries as well. Queer people and their allies. People who are not the state, but people who happen to live under that state due to the arbitrary nature of borders and the lottery of birth. And as a result of that, we think it's extremely important that the fans of these artists have access to those live performances. Firstly, why do they miss out on something extremely valuable when you don't go to these countries? Firstly, we'd point out it's very hard to travel anywhere else because it's very expensive. Secondly, if you do try to see this artist somewhere else, you need to compete with that destination's market for tickets where you're likely to miss out. And thirdly, we'd point out that any alternative misses the point of the fact that live music is the particularly valuable commodity that is now being restricted. It's not just, listen to them on Spotify or, watch like the documentary about the music, about the show that happens later. In particular, the benefits we'll explain are attached to live music. What are those benefits? Firstly, these people get to enjoy a better show. That is, live shows contain things like spontaneity, fan interaction, either like planned and structured like a meet and greet, or just occurs during a show. Things like a more exciting and accepting atmosphere that you get to be a part of, and even little things like your ability to buy merch. Things which seem kind of very trivial, but for people who really love these artists and who care about them, are important trinkets which represent for them a part of their life, a part of their experiences, and things that is important for them to access. But secondly, the benefit you miss out on if you don't go or you only watch online is the community that exists at these shows. That is, being able to meet other queer people, other allies, other people who are likely to have similar views to you. And importantly, these shows are queer spaces with a huge amount of plausible deniability. That is, these shows, as these guys point out, isn't explicitly marketed as a show only for queer people, or which is like a queer political rally, but obviously they attract fans who are more likely to share views with you. And that's why their arguments about a lack of safety really fall on deaf ears, because it's unclear why the show would be a target for hatred or violence when there are active rallies for queer rights, when there are activist groups. I'm going to point out, in addition, these shows tend to be extremely public. They're one of the few opportunities where the eyes of the world are on these countries, and it's just incredibly implausible that acts of mass violence take place at these shows, and that's why so few actually have. What is the impact of this argument? Well, firstly, we'd point out that these benefits are extremely substantial for the people that they accrue to, because often that music or that artist represents parts of your life. When you were young, when you were questioning, formative years, these songs counseled you through them, offered comfort, offered self-expression, and the ability to access the benefits we describe in connection with something so important to you as a person is important. But we'd also point out the opportunity to do something similar, access these communities, access this kind of atmosphere, are very few and far between when you live in an oppressive country or in an oppressive jurisdiction, making it incredibly important that you access these shows when they happen. Secondly, we'd point out that these people are important to the debate. Unlike the characterization of this side, which sees the name Saudi Arabia queer and assumes everyone is homophobic. Many of the people who live in these countries are queer, are allies, are vulnerable and in an oppressive context, which means we should really value their access to these shows, their ability to access this atmosphere. But we'd also point out that just some version of this benefit applies to all the attendees, like 60,000 people now don't get to see a show multiple times a year, shows which might be important to them, maybe for less politically significant reasons, but equally significant ones to them. So in the sum of this argument, fans are important, they miss out, and yes, they're right, it's not a right to access this stuff, but it's extremely valuable from a practical point of view. Second argument is why our site is good for queer rights. The first thing to note is just our counter model achieves a number of extremely valuable things which you couldn't achieve if you just didn't go there. Like donations to Trans Lifeline, goes directly to stuff like mental health support, directly to stuff like gender affirming care. And now we have a really strong way to encourage these artists to actually make those donations, and it's something that we uniquely stand for. But we'll also point out that things like social media and messaging are way more likely to fall on deaf ears if you're just calling out something in a country that many of your fans don't care about or haven't heard of. Whereas if it's a tour you're going on, where people are following, people are invested, you're much more likely to access like a bully pulpit and convince people. And we point out that unlike other forms of messaging, your message that queer rights matter is likely to accrue much more quickly because many of your fans are young, you're not uprooting decades of homophobia. These young people might be prone to worshipping idols and caring about artists, and you are one of those people who command a strong position to tell them what you think matters. The final benefit we would note is that this site has a pretty substantial discouragement on artists cultivating queer followings in the first place. That's for the reason that you are substantially economically punished in a world where you do so, and their case applies. You lose lucrative opportunities like, according to them, performing in Texas, performing in the UAE, all very popular venues which artists regularly go to. What this means is you're far less likely to include queer themes in your music to try to cultivate that audience. You're much less likely to try to include queer fans when you meet them, or make a show of accepting these people. And as we pointed out in our first argument, music and art is important to people. It's formative, it counsels them through hard times and helps them express themselves. So discouraging artists from offering that to queer people, clearly a harm. Proud to oppose.
The negative team tries to have their cake and eat it too in this debate when they tell you that, we're going to go, perform in these places, but we're going to raise awareness at the same time, we're going to donate. I would point to two things that's wrong with that. Because firstly, at the point at which you do that, the fans who attend your concert lose all plausible deniability that they are not queer, that they are, just going there because they love the music. Because you have now outed this entire concert, essentially, as associated with the queer rights movement. In the sorts of places they tell you about, in the sorts of places we talk about in this debate, where it is dangerous to be queer, where it is dangerous to be outed, where you face significant risk, I think that just exacerbates the risk of violence that you face by attending these sorts of things. That when you go hardline and you are a stan and you do want to show yourself at these concerts, but they are now explicitly associated with these sorts of movements, that's a significant risk you're in. On the other side though, they have to cop that the amount of publicity that they get is significantly smaller. And I think that was just always going to be true, right? Because what does conservative media report on? Does it report on Taylor Swift doing a concert in general? Or does it report on the fact that, she might have said some things about it, she might have made a donation to an organization? I think probably most mainstream media platforms just report on the fact that this is an artist who is incredibly high profile. That was because it was more palatable to report on those sorts of things. That was because it was simply something that garnered a lot more attention and that was something that these states were likely to capitalize on. In that way, all of the rainbow washing stuff that we tell you from Rose still stands in this debate, but also they just exacerbate the harm to the ability to make change. I'm going to do two things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to deal with the idea of fans, and secondly, I'm going to deal with the actual capacity to make change. Also just noting quickly, Dan says that we're going too soft line and there's no violence in Texas, you've got to stand behind more examples. Check your notes, we never actually narrowed the debate like that. We did support those examples. Okay, so first let's deal with fans. Dan tells you that the obligation to fans does not exist, because essentially, whatever, they're just your fans. The first thing I would note is that I think that he misses the nuance, which is that we tell you that you profit specifically off the culture, and you do this in a really active way. For instance, artists like Harry Styles, like Taylor Swift, specifically and actively went out and targeted these sorts of, fans in order to profit off of what they identified as and to catch on to different sorts of ways of rising to the top in media and in different fan bases. But secondly, I would simply note that their case tacitly agrees that this sort of obligation exists in that they are prioritizing the interests of this actor, the interests of the fans, and what is going to be best for them. I think that even if you don't believe that this obligation exists, our benefits still stand, which is to say that we give you emotional reasons why this is incredibly important that they never really deal with. And that was, if you were a queer person living in an incredibly repressive state that dehumanized you constantly, that told you that you did not deserve rights, that told you that you were a lesser human, that made you feel like you yourself were wrong, and your hero, your favorite artist said, they're actually wrong for that. I do not stand behind this. This is actively a terrible thing, and I am going to make a very, potentially personally detrimental stand against it. That was incredibly validating, especially at the point at which you recognize that the way this is likely to be presented to those people is in that way. It's not, I am abandoning you. It is, I stand with you against your oppressor. I stand with you against the people who are doing harm to you. Given that the people who were living in these conditions also probably felt that way, also probably agreed that their governments were doing shit things and that those things should be stood against and boycotted, I thought this was a massive benefit in this debate that I think wins us this debate and they need to deal with in the next speech. The next thing that they tell you on this issue is that you deprive these queer fans of the artists that they want to see, and that's a massive benefit. The first thing to say is that when they say, oh, it's about live music, that's an argument for why live music should be free, but obviously it's not. Lots of people can't access live music in either world. I think that the fact is that the majority of the world still access their music through things like online platforms, through things like streaming platforms. That was where you found these artists. That was where you developed your connection to these artists. That was where you access them every single day. I think that it's not true that you can't find community. Lots of stans had still never seen their artists live. I think that it's not such a massive harm in this debate. Weigh that against what we bring you at Rose, where it is you are being literally recognized by your hero. You are being, literally shown and validated in your existence in this way. But I would also just note that just because, Taylor Swift doesn't come this time round doesn't mean that you won't one day get to see her. I think that people often feel this sort of way that they missed a concert, they feel let down. This was not a harm that was unique or particularly hard way in this debate. I think lastly then, it's important to note that the physical violence that we bring to you is still a harm, and it's a harm that is worse on their side, because I think that, as I note in my introduction, when you are actively going out and being like, oh yeah, this concert that I'm doing in this place, this is about the queer community, you are bringing targets to it. If you believe that, this is a place that has a large level of homophobia and a lack of rights, that means that you're likely to do things like attract crowds to these sorts of stadiums, to go for gay bashing. You are likely to do things like attract increased police enforcement. But people are in a position where they're not particularly rational. They're engaging in stan culture. They're probably not thinking too much. They're thinking this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see someone. They're probably going to out themselves in ways that they may not otherwise do. That brings them a massive risk that I think you should not put them under in their side. They are super vulnerable. They do not have recourse through rights. They cannot take people who bash them to court. They're probably unwilling to engage in law enforcement. That was something that was massive. That was a harm that lost in the debate. So either they have to trade off safety, which is terrible, or they have to trade off raising awareness. I'm going to deal now with the next issue on change, and I'm going to assume that they can have their cake and eat it too, and they can donate and raise awareness. First thing to note here is that obviously we can also do things like donate and raise awareness. In fact, we can do them to a much larger extent. The reason why it doesn't work on their side is that I think that these artists just steal a lot of the publicity away, which is to say that a lot of media outlets are more likely to focus on the concert than they are on the sorts of awareness that you're raising. Maybe the West still is like, oh, Tay-Tay said some things about Indonesia, but that's unlikely to make the same sort of an impact because it simply steals the attention. On the counterfactual, where you say, I refuse to perform because of this, that is just obviously better. If you believe their side that it's a good thing to raise awareness, it's just better when you say, I refuse to engage in this regime because they're doing such terrible stuff. That's a much stronger indictment that you make. But I also think it seems super hypocritical of the artist when you go, this is a terrible regime, but I'm going to play there anyway. And that's likely to be portrayed by media, especially media that's critical of queer rights, as something that is like you trading off your values. Clearly it's not that bad. And, Tay-Tay, who's like a noted ally, still wants to play there. So I guess it's all right for those fans, right? This is something that's likely to cut under your legitimacy. It's likely to take away any strength that your message had on their side. But I noticed that on our side, the amount of publicity that you're able to gain by being like, yeah, look at how bad this is, means you're able to do things like raise funds. You're likely to get an increase of donations from other people. You're likely to raise more votes for change. You're likely to get things like more volunteers to support NGOs and queer movements. That made a meaningful change to the lives of people on the ground. Because if you could support something like a shelter that helped homeless queer people, if you were able to get things like, just people who volunteer at health clinics and stuff like that, more raising awareness within communities, that was a massive change to people's lives that we were able to unlock on our side when we raised the awareness in places that otherwise lacked attention on it. The next thing that I would say though is that I think we have a significant amount of scope that they never have to actually influence a lot of individuals. And that was to say that I think that even if a lot of fans of these people are not queer themselves, or perhaps are not allies in the status quo, they are incredibly sympathetic to this artist. They care about this artist, which means that they're likely to take on what that artist says. They're likely to be like, oh, if if Beyonce thinks it's really that big of an issue, maybe it is quite a big issue. Maybe this is something I worry about. Maybe, she has blamed the government for this. Maybe I should also blame the government. Maybe I should also blame my state's legislature and think that it is unfair. And I think, think here about all the 15-year-olds around the world who are obsessed with Taylor Swift. I think they probably just eat up what she tells them. If she's like, this is wrong, they probably go, yeah, it is wrong, because they are likely to be incredibly sympathetic to that actor. That was a massive benefit when we got more support on an individual local level because people bought in so much more. I think at that point it's pretty clear that we are able to get greater change and greater awareness. So proud to propose.
I'm going to begin by weighing our benefits that we bring to fans compared to theirs. That is the benefit of seeing an artist whom you love, who might have made you realise that you were queer, who's guided you through difficult times in your life, whose music you deeply resonate with, and whose concert you would be willing to spend upwards of $1,000 to see. This is vastly more important than the speculative political change they bring for 3 reasons. Firstly, because it is a concrete and certain impact. We know that people want to see these concerts because they would spend $1,000 on them, because people outrage on social media when Taylor Swift declines to perform in lots of places in Southeast Asia, and Affirmative deprives them of that benefit. Secondly, because it's the impact that matters to these people. These people are not necessarily political activists. Many of these people, yes, are queer. That doesn't mean their ultimate goal in life is changing policy in their state. They care very deeply about seeing their hero live. These people are definitionally Beyonce or Lizzo or Taylor Swift fans. They're not definitionally political activists. It's not clear that they agree on the kinds of political changes that these artists might in their world be supporting. Maybe people have different views, but we understand that they care about concerts. And thirdly, it is a less circuitous route to the Affirmative team's own benefits, because maybe in their very, very best case, they swing a few homophobic politicians who are now 20% more likely to vote in favour of formal cohabitation rights because they really care about what Taylor Swift has to say. But we get queer community and queer flourishing informally already straight away. You do not have to go through all the layers that they do. So let's talk about what we bring to fans. We explain that live music is very important to these people and we bring it to them. They give a couple of responses. The first thing they say is, well, this is not important, you can listen to an album. Such a glib and lazy response. We explain a range of specific benefits of live music from Daniel that you cannot access elsewhere. It's an incredibly exciting event. There's way more spontaneity. You get to see the artist in person. Often there are things like meet and greets. You get to meet up with other people in your community, and extremely difficult, inconvenient, and expensive to access those concerts in another city. We say you meet up with queer people in community, and note it's super important that you do have some form of plausible deniability here, and I'll rebut that in more detail in a moment. But compared to, say, going to a queer club, which is another way of making valuable bonds with other queer people, where you put yourself in direct danger, you can go to a Taylor Swift concert, meet people who are like 70% queer, but say, well, actually, I just really like her music, or actually, I'm going because my friends are going. That is super valuable. Finally, it is just the revealed preference of these people who spend thousands of dollars on Taylor Swift or Beyonce tickets, who are outraged when these people don't stay in their states. Second Affirmative repeats, well, it's not a right to see music. Yeah, fucking obviously. But we're saying it's a good thing that you should not deprive people of. It's a huge benefit in this debate. What do they say in terms of aggressive material? They have 3 pushes. Firstly, and most ridiculously, they say attending this concert is dangerous. 1, I'd observe that this is an incredibly patronizing argument. Even if it is true, people can choose to undergo some risk for the sake of substantial benefit, and you should believe that people are pretty aware of some risk that might exist because they're living in a homophobic country with homophobic laws already, because they've chosen to spend thousands of dollars on this ticket or hundreds of dollars on this ticket anyway. People are adults, they can choose to go to this concert. But secondly, it is an obviously untrue argument for 3 reasons. First, because you do have plausible deniability. The second Affirmative asserts you don't, which is ridiculous. You can just say, I really like Beyonce's music. I'm going because my friends are going. There are obviously non-queer fans who exist, and you have that plausible deniability to the state, to the public, to your family, even to yourself if you're a questioning or closeted queer person who wants to experience that community without coming out in your own circles. But secondly, there are other reasons artists invest in security. They're often extremely secure events because that artist themselves does not want danger, because it would be a PR disaster if they perform in a homophobic state and then there's like a gay bashing outside of their concert, especially if you believe the Affirmative's analysis. That's the kind of liability and PR disaster Lizzo does not want to overcome. But thirdly, there obviously is safety in numbers. You have lots and lots of people there. You have non-queer fans. Empirically, artists invest in a huge amount of safety. Often they're legally compelled to do so. Secondly, they say, well, artists feel really bad because their artist is supporting their evil country. I just want to note how many contingencies there are in this argument. There is so much random garbage that you just have to believe. Firstly, you have to ignore our counter model, which is, sorry, I don't mean garbage in a pejorative sense. I just mean there's a lot of stuff going on. Firstly, you would have to believe that our counter model doesn't work, which is that artists can't also, say, criticize the country while they play there. Secondly, it relies on fans being supported by abandonment, which is a very unintuitive premise. And thirdly, it relies on fans caring more about the political stance of that artist than the experience of seeing them live in concert, which I explain is very unintuitive. But I think that you can do all the other things we support, providing money, providing support on social media, which is much more important. The final thing they say is, well, there's a principal harm to profit off queer audiences while supporting bad states. One, this is obviously contingent on the rest of the debate. We think we do a better job of supporting queer movements in these states. Secondly, as Daniel notes, this is not a one-way trade. You benefit fans, even if it is true that you also profit off them. But I'll add two additional responses. One, many of these artists are queer themselves. Obviously, not all of these artists are, but you should believe it's likely they are because they have the capacity to write queer music or the interest in doing so, because they have a familiarity with queer tropes and culture. Many of these people are queer themselves. They should be able to play this music. They should be able to live or act in these states. But thirdly, even if that's not the case, they're likely to be very good allies. And I note that the more sensitive your use of queer culture, the bigger your queer fan base is. So this debate applies the most for the least appropriative and the most sensitive artists, because those are the people who are able to mass the biggest queer fan base. So clearly we're better for fans. Secondly then, on the queer movement, we bring a range of pushes at Daniel. The first is our counter model, which is we just give money, support, and criticism. Second speaker says, well, firstly, media won't report on this criticism. One, you can say that on your own platform, on your Instagram or Twitter account. You don't need other media to report on you as Taylor Swift or Lizzo. You can put out a statement condemning the policies of these countries. But secondly, obviously it's controversial and interesting. Of course, media are going to report, and that is their own mechanism, right? Which is people are interested in hypocrisy. Some people will spin this into hypocrisy. Maybe that happens, that just means you get more media reporting. Secondly, they say, well, artists can donate too on their side, but they obviously cannot because they're not doing the concert in the first place. So they A, have way less money to donate, B, don't have any of the PR pressure to donate, and three, there's a counter fiat, which means we're able to push them to donate more. And that is winning material in and of itself, because maybe they get Lizzo to condemn the UAE, but we get literally millions of dollars to trans youth charities that you would not get otherwise. Compare just how important those sets of benefits are. I'm going to bring some substantive though, which is, firstly, this makes the queer movement just seem massively Western, which is really, really bad. First, if I did weekly preempts this when they're like, well, some developing states are pro-LGBT. Yeah, that's true, but I think the majority of states that artists would be declining to perform in are, in fact, developing countries. It is just empirically true. It's also because queer progress often tracks economic development. And that means that these artists do just seem as though they are abandoning the developing world. It seems like the queer movement is something that only exists in rich countries for rich people, which is terrible. It means that you decrease support for the queer movement within those states, and you also get more internal fracturing within that movement. But the second thing I'll note is that this music, by way of substantive, is that this music is a really effective way of increasing support for queer rights, because it gently normalizes those kinds of messages. Because you have queer messages that are couched in plausible deniability, because they're universal love stories that queer people really resonate with, but you can also apply to queer straight couples as well. And it explains that the love felt by LGBT people is equivalent to the love felt by straight people. That is the argument made by these artists and the way this music is interpreted. It's also very difficult and very unpopular to shut down these concerts, unlike, say, more explicit forms of political activism, because they have so much backing, because they are so popular. And as our team is fond of saying, miles are comprised of centimeters, and this is a very effective way of changing people's minds. The final push they give in response is, well, maybe you're seen as hypocritical because you criticize these countries. No, that is ridiculous. See our counter model. Secondly, it's very easy to justify your criticism because you're playing in this, justify playing in this place because you're like, I want to serve my fans here. Thirdly, I note that their benefit of saying you cancel the tour because the country is homophobic requires some degree of involvement in the first place, so it's unclear they get that discourse without our model. In every way, this is a clear slam dunk decide negative.
I think that when you make millions of dollars a year
from deliberately putting imagery in your songs that speaks to queer fans, that purports to represent their experience, but then you gladly go and make millions of dollars by performing in countries and potentially to audiences who hold unbelievably cruel and negative views of that community, who pay taxes that benefit politicians, who pass laws that make it illegal to be gay in those countries. I actually think that you are committing a morally wrong action when you do that. And I think that as a person who has immense public sway and public capacity to make change, to bring significant attention, as someone who politicians literally get their delegates, like in South Australia, to lobby Taylor Swift, to beg for a concert to happen there, I think that you have a significant amount of power, and I think that you can make a lot of change. Dan says you don't have an obligation to your fans who are queer because, firstly, you're just exchanging goods and services. Secondly, your level of privilege is irrelevant and not real analysis. And thirdly, your fans are voluntarily supporting you. Firstly, I think that in this debate we recognise that music and art have an effect that is different to, say, construction supplies. And I think that we're able to appreciate that the significance of goods and services that represent your experience and that help produce your identity and allow you to understand yourself and conceptualize it yourself are probably somewhat different. And I think that when the specific appeal of those goods and services is that they are something that alleges to specifically represent you and to create a space for your community, if you are making money from the exchange of those things, I don't think we have to prove like a contractual principle that you have to your fans, but I think we can accept that it is probably morally off color, at least, to go and make a huge amount of money performing in places where it is illegal for most of your fans to express who they truly are, when your music is meant to provide them a safe space to do that. Secondly, I think that your privilege is incredibly important because this reflects your capacity to make this change. Because firstly, you're very economically able to do so. Yes, maybe you lose a bit of money from not doing a stadium show in Texas, but you can make a lot of money doing stadium shows in California. And so I think it is really important that you have the specific capacity, because compare this to the capacity of any other act that they suggest should make these changes, like the queer activists that maybe they give $20,000 to from a concert, or being generous, maybe $300,000. Because those people were vastly less privileged, and outing themselves as queer to be activists, which their charitable mechanism really relies upon to get any substantive change, was much less they were much less able to do that. Because Taylor Swift, who often courts media attention for speculations about her sexuality, but is publicly perceived as straight, is able to have a significant amount more capacity to make these changes. She won't lose her job. She will still make millions of dollars a year, but she also has a huge amount of spotlight on her, which someone who maybe gets a shout out at her stadium concert one day every 5 years when she goes there for an album, and maybe gets a little bit of money to fund their advocacy, can still lose their job and can still be made homeless for having to out themselves in order to get any of these benefits. I think that privilege is very important, and I think when that privilege comes off the back of retweets and media approbation and album streams and stuff like that from queer fans, you do owe an obligation, because I think you owe an obligation to all of your fans, but you should, especially as an incredibly privileged, well-off person with a significant capacity to make a change, try and think about the fans who are worst off, but often do a disproportionate amount of the stuff that makes you wealthy. Like Rose and Elanor explained to you, the stan culture is often deeply ingrained, but also that you're often using imagery like ballroom imagery in Beyonce's music, which is particularly beneficial to acquire that privilege. And lastly, they tell you that you support these artists in a voluntary way. Also obvious, but sure, I think it is possibly important that you are still deliberately cultivating these networks of fans, that it is something that is often a deliberate marketing tactic, and I think that to the extent that you are willing to do that, you probably, again, owe an obligation to people whose lived experience you are capitalizing on to make a significant amount of money, to try and make that lived experience a little bit more livable, to make it a little bit more possible to publicly be yourself, or not to fear for your safety. They say that your obligation to other fans is more important, but I think if you compare the specific harms that can occur to their fans, they try and poo-poo away material about how you can actually experience violence, and that there probably are going to be people who at the very least are denigrated on the public transport on their way home from the concert, because no one is going to ask them, are you at the Harry Styles concert because you're queer or because you just like the music? They're just going to immediately attack you and be very unpleasant. I think that to the extent that these things exist, I think that your obligation to those fans who are so hard off are more important than your obligations to your other fans, because that obligation is also an incredibly tenuous one. They tell you it's obvious that you don't have a right to see live music. But I think that is quite important because so much of their material is about how nice seeing live music is. I think that when you weigh that up against the incredible benefit that actually being recognized for being someone who is incredibly marginalized in a place like the Philippines, where you feel like you get zero media attention because there is never any reporting on it, and finally your idol tells you, I actually recognize this, and I think I should go through personal, financial distress, like not getting to make $1 million from like a show in Manila, because I care about what is happening to you. I think that obligation is important. Next, on the consequences this has for your queer fans. They tell you in Sophie's speech that there is outrage when Taylor Swift doesn't want to perform in Southeast Asia. I also, as I pointed out in my introduction, politicians literally actively lobby incredibly public, well-known celebrities and things like that to come to their states because there are such major benefits to things like the tourism industry, to the hotel industry, and because those lobby groups are actually relatively powerful and do really, really care about the millions and millions of dollars that change hands when a bunch of people come to a capital city to watch a show. I think beyond that, there's also the experience of support that is valuable in making this change, that when you feel perceived, when you feel like your struggle isn't futile, when you feel like you're getting some level of media attention, you're more likely to want to do it. And they can say, okay, but you'll get like a shout out for being gay, or like a shout out for being a gay charity in your concert. But I think it is much more validating when someone says, I'm actually going to go to a significant personal expense in order to show that I care about you. I think as well as that, the fact of unifying the experience of queer people, making it something that actually also has negative consequences on straight people, means that there is a vastly larger group of people who are directly interested in changing this legislation. Because now it's not just that 3% of the population want to be able to get married to someone of the same sex. It's like 70% of the population, at least of 15-year-old girls, want to be able to see a Taylor Swift concert. And so a lot of people lobby, and they annoy their parents. And I think that actually does have a level of voting change, because people recognize this is really bad, and it must be really bad for someone like Taylor not to want to come here. I think to the extent that they say there is a significant financial harm to these, there is a significant amount of financial harm that would occur when these people don't come to perform in these places. I think it is really good because you unite the interest as well of people who are experiencing those financial harms, things like the hotel lobby and stuff like that. They can tell you that you may still report on these virtue signals made at the concerts in the UAE where it is not legal to be publicly gay, but I think you report far more on it and you get far more media attention. That means eyeballs on you. That means NGOs actively lobbying you. That means other countries saying, hey, I think that this is not okay. And I think that's really important. Compare this to their benefit, which is that for 3 hours you have queer flourishing and community where 70% of people are gay. I think firstly that this obviously does open you up to a higher probability of concerning violence and stuff like that. But I think that that is also just an incredibly short-term benefit that then it fades away and there is no lasting impact. Whereas if someone has made a significant financial harm occur to your country or to your state, especially places like Texas, which really care about this because of their incredibly poor legislation about queer people, that is good. Because that means, and especially if they want to widen the debate to places like Texas, that we can get relatively small incremental changes that massively improve people's quality of life, and that is a mile made out of centimeters. I think all of those states are very valuable. Lastly, on the queer audience, they say now you will no longer want to cultivate a queer audience. I think that this is not true. I think firstly, there is still a huge number of places where you can perform, like all of the EU, and they're likely to be quite wealthy and pay for your show slot. Secondly, when you're emerging, obviously you want all of the fans that you get, so you're unlikely to look so far into the future and think, but maybe I won't be able to do a stadium show in the UAE when you're a country singer with 20,000 fans. I think that you still cared about these people, but because you cared about them, you had an incredibly strong obligation, you had a capacity to make significant change. Very proud to propose.
Problem with this affirmative case is that after 3 speeches, they still haven't yet grappled with the true burden of this debate. We explained to you 66 countries, 1/3 of all countries, criminalise directly being gay. A further 1/3 of all countries imposed numerous sanctions on things like public expressions, sexuality if you're queer, or things like gay sex. And the burden on this team is even higher, because it says jurisdictions like Texas, which yes, have bad laws for the queer community, but by global standards are some of the most, nice places you could be if you're a queer person, are out for artists to perform in this debate. And we explain that when that is the context, when you can't perform in any of these jurisdictions, obviously it was deeply, deeply economically unprofitable to cultivate relationships with the queer community, the consequence was that you just immediately lost something like, 170 countries you could even perform in, and you were left with only the most developed, only the most friendly countries at the end. Obviously, this is a world in which artists just do not cultivate queer followings. This is obviously just a world in which they do not engage with these communities to begin with. We get one response across 24 minutes of substantive content to this claim, which is just, you could still perform in the European Union. Yeah, you can't perform anywhere else, and obviously, if you believe that these artists have some sense of business consideration, they'll obviously weigh up the benefits of appealing to the queer community, which this team says they do in a very explicit and calculated fashion because it gives them monetary gain. They will weigh that against the benefit of performing in places like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, that have trillions of dollars of VC money slushing around, and they tell you are extremely profitable, which is why it is immoral for them to perform there in the first place. And obviously, the way up there means they just do not support these communities. They just do not engage in their culture. They do not produce art that represents and helps queer people. They lose out on that representation. They lose out on that community. If you believe this team's principle that you have an obligation to this community, obviously it is breached far worse in the instance where these people get zero support from famous artists than in the world in which perhaps they get imperfect support, which is our world. That's the fastest way to explain why side negative wins, but let's go through the remaining ways. Secondly, we explained to you that we are far more likely to get effective forms of change for improving queer rights in these contexts. This argument is important because, again, it speaks to the principle that it is this team's primary lens for viewing the debate. So if you believe that these artists do have an obligation, if we demonstrate that we get better rights for people in these countries, that is obviously a far better way to fulfill the obligation that we owe to those particular fans than some sort of virtue signaling boycott that is likely to be ineffective, as I'll explain now. Why do we get substantial change? The first reason we explain is that we're able to accrue large amounts of donations. And Affirmative does a lot of the legwork here to explain why these donations would be very large when they explain to you how lucrative these tours are and how likely they are to generate huge amounts of profit for the artists involved. We say a portion of those proceeds immediately goes to providing things like gender-affirming care in these countries, to providing things like shelters, to building things like support networks that allow people to survive when they otherwise could not. But secondly, we explain that we're likely to get far more effective call-outs. Noting that this is basically the only mechanism they have on their side for improving treatment in these countries, we explain it's more likely to be effective on our side. Why? Firstly, we point out that you can engage in specific forms of call-out that engage with the practices and laws in that country, and that notably, the fact that you're on tour means you're likely to have far more media coverage than when you're not on tour in a particular country. Secondly, the fact that you can have a more specific audience and speak to people within that country who have a greater capacity to affect change within that jurisdiction than people who do not live there, but also just that you're far more likely to be influential at a point in time when you're actually doing that tour, when you're actually engaging with other countries, and when you're able to level specific critiques against specific jurisdictions than in a world in which you just stay home and make those particular critiques. No explanation as to why it is that you get the kinds of response on their side. They have two responses to this argument. The first thing they say is, well, you undercut your legitimacy if you go to the place anyway, because everyone will assume it must be good or not that bad, otherwise you wouldn't go. We explain, firstly, it's unclear that it's true. People often go to countries where they have moral objections to what occurs there. Like, many countries have many laws, and people object to many different things. If you literally only went to places where you agreed with, at least the preponderance of laws that exist, you would vastly curtail your capacity to engage in any form of economic activity. But secondly, we explain to you that obviously these artists have the capacity to curate the narrative around why it is they're going or why it is that they're not going. So you can explain, I'm going here because I believe it's important to go and meet my fans and to support them in this context, but I really do not believe that this law is just, and I think that you should support me, should donate to these charities, and should help in attempting to repeal these particular laws. The second response is to say, well, on our side, the boycott will be very effective because it'll convince fans that they need to care about issues they might otherwise not. Firstly, we suggest that fans are probably the most likely to have already cared about these issues if they, believe in these artists and follow them to the extent that this team suggests. But also, it seems like that is relatively symmetric, and you could also just go to the country and talk to your fans and explain to them why they need to care about this issue. They would also realize that this is a very serious issue in that particular instance. So, at the end of this argument, if you believe that we are more likely to get change, which you should, that is another way that we can win the debate, because it is a better way of discharging the obligation that this team claims exists than what they suggest. Finally though, let's engage with their principle and explain why it is insufficient to win them the debate. They tell us two things. Firstly, that you owe an obligation to fans for three reasons. Firstly, because fans give you benefits like fame and virtue and access to a community. We explain to you firstly that in return you provide value in the form of your art. There's no explanation as to why you owe an additional net obligation beyond that, which is what the transaction comprises. But secondly, to the extent that what fans do for you is voluntary, then obviously it doesn't generate additional obligations. Someone's voluntary act cannot obligate you to do something in return, otherwise it wasn't voluntary. Secondly, they say that you're privileged, which we agree with, but say that that doesn't generate a specific obligation to engage in this practice. It just generates a general obligation which we discharge via, for example, donations, via, for example, call-outs. Thirdly, they say, well, you actively target the community, which is distinct from just receiving benefits from the community. But we would say, for example, a business that offers a seniors discount does not then accrue a specific moral obligation to care for old people, in the same way that just because you happen to identify a good customer base for your product does not mean that suddenly you're obliged to engage with them in any particular way. But thirdly, we just point out that many of these artists are themselves queer, which suggests that the extent to which this obligation exists does not accrue because they're obviously not appropriating in that instance. But secondly, even if you believe the obligation exists, we contend that it's not breached by this policy. Why? They say, one, you're turning a blind eye to queer rights. We explain this is explicitly untrue because we do things like donations and call-outs. And it's also unclear that, for example, performing in Texas is an indication that you don't care about queer rights or that you're turning a blind eye to queer rights. Secondly, they say this supports bad regimes, but we say it does so in a very indirect way. For example, in monetary terms, who you're really assisting is the restaurants, the hotels, the inns, and the small businesses that exist around where you hold the concert. Maybe the regime gets some benefit through tax money or something, but to the extent you believe that principle, you would also believe we should never trade with or allow remittances to go to any of these countries because it would affect those regimes in an indirect manner, and we would say that is unlikely. But secondly, we suggest it doesn't legitimize the regime when you engage in the call-out that we specify. Lastly, they say, well, there's a risk of danger to fans in these contexts. We explain fans should have the capacity to make that choice for themselves, but it's also untrue. You obviously have plausible deniability. You won't just attack every Harry Styles fan assuming they're queer. Insane claim. There's security at these events, there's safety in numbers, and a spotlight from international audiences that means it's unlikely these countries would allow violence to kick off. Finally, even if it's true that there is a breach of this obligation and it does exist, we explain it falls worse on their side because artists don't create any of the art, because you get less change to queer rights. This obligation doesn't exist, but if it did exist, it wasn't breached, and if it was breached, it was breached worse on their side. Finally, we waive a range of important benefits to fans that they don't contend with. The spontaneity that makes it an experience, the interaction that makes it meaningful, the merch that allows you to remember the event, the community building that allows you to meet other people, and form deep connections to artists that were deeply, deeply important and deeply meaningful within this community. Our hinges their case on one principle, we defeat it in detail, we outweigh it with practical benefits, and we explain why the harms to fans and the queer movement also make them lose the debate on their own metric.
Messaging and fans, second on direct support and loss. Let's start with messaging and fans. Each team has a mechanism to help messaging and help fans. I'll directly weigh them against each other. We say you should perform for those fans, you should give them a valuable experience, you should donate and advertise. Their claim is you should just ignore the country and make a statement there. Ours is more valuable for 4 reasons. The first thing we explain is that these fans are not complex political actors. They're not assessing down the line every form of political message. They're not analysing the potential political power of every single claim. They care far more about being able to access these unique opportunities, being able to engage with the artists that they care so much about. Secondly, we explain in terms of duration, a one-off rejection of going on a specific tour or visiting a specific country is unlikely to generate the same amount of messaging benefit or political engagement that repeated spotlight on the country does when you go there, when you actually perform, when you consistently donate. So even if you care about messaging, we achieve that much more. Thirdly, we point out this revealed preference by the vulnerable actors, the fans and the people in this country in this debate, to actually receive the show rather than be rejected and receive some sort of political message. Because the average reasonable voter is much likely to see all over the internet requests to come to Thailand or requests to come to Saudi Arabia, rather than legions of fans imaginarily saying, please don't come to our country, we would hate it if you came here. But finally, we also point out that our benefit is substantially more concrete than the speculative line of analysis this team sets up. We say the concrete benefit is you get to go, you get to enjoy an atmosphere, you get to enjoy a good time, whereas theirs relies on so many connections and lines of logic, the analysis for which is extremely thin. That you have to hate your country so much you don't want people to come here. You have to believe that this message would be particularly effective. The fans need to understand this message and prioritize it over their own interests. All things necessary to believe their claim, none of which prove it. But secondly on this issue, compare the analytical depth of what each team provides. We explain in depth why live music is important. The show is qualitatively different. It's a unique form of community, and it's valuable to both the direct queer fans who are represented, who are formed by this music music and express themselves through this music, and everyone who gets to enjoy the show, numbers which add up over time, and indeed kilometres are comprised of centimetres. On top, we explain that this is safe because the artist has a huge amount of legal liability, there's a huge amount of negative publicity if things go wrong, and you've got plausible deniability. The only response to all of that being, they'll just attack everyone, seems extremely unlikely. They say, in comparison, well, you get to be validated if things say no. And this is, once again, where the analytical depth provides a severe problem. It's deeply unintuitive that fans want an artist to ignore them. It relies on making a meal out of this abandonment by the artist in order to achieve the benefit of feeling validated. Things we explain down the bench are unlikely to happen because ignoring a country for its moral position is controversial. It's unlikely to be something that's, a big statement and constantly referred to by these artists. If you care about messaging, if you care about discharging a principal obligation, both in terms of weight and analytical depth, we clearly take it. But our entirely distinct way to win the debate is just on direct support and loss, where we just run away with the debate. We say that you generate a bunch of donation, which only occurs under our side of the house, because you actually go on the tour. There is PR pressure to donate because you are going on a tour, which is morally dubious. And if you believe the hypocrisy stuff, then this mechanism works. And thirdly, that the counterfactual, that we have counter fiat, which is an additional meta reason to think on net more donation can be enforced by our side than their side. But we also say that their side discourages including queer themes in your music. And you might be thinking as a judge, well, you said very little on it, but it receives no response, and their analysis provides the proof for it. Because if you believe their characterization that artists are deeply calculating about how they engage with social issues, and that this is a big statement with a very high cost, that is the exact reason why you're likely to simply just reduce the representation, to not engage with these themes, to not reach out to fans and show that your music is a safe space for queer people. And this argument, which skates through so unscathed by this team, is extremely high impact, because third speaker is right that art is a special commodity and they create less of it. They deny queer people the right to see themselves in media, to access a form of representation and self-expression in a way which is just so deeply unacceptable. Proud to oppose.
Pretty funny how Udai wasn't in prep and then managed to revive a 15-second mechanism that then at reply becomes this negative team's entire case, despite being vastly unimportant in this debate. I'm going to do 3 things for you in this reply. First, I'm going to talk about the extent of your obligation to queer fans. Secondly, who helped queer fans on the ground now. Thirdly, who helped them in the long term. First of all, what's the extent of your obligation to queer fans? This negative team says that you don't have one because your goods and services exchange is complete, the point where they listen to and enjoy your music. A couple of things. We think this is insufficient for 3 reasons. Firstly, we think it's because you actively profited off queer culture. Beyonce literally vogues for 20 minutes on the Renaissance tour. Be fucking serious, guys. This isn't just like, oh, the queers like your music. It's like they actively took their culture and profited off it. If I plagiarized Dan's speech and then worked for his mortal enemy, that would probably be wrong. Because they played into queer-specific fan cultures, i.e. fans tweeting like, that's mother, and they often actively queer-baited or played on their relationship to queer people in order to promote their music. Thirdly, because it's literally acknowledged by this negative team. When Sophie tells you that any concrete benefit to queer fans is the win condition for this debate in her introductory way, then they say, oh shit, that's probably true. And their case becomes about who can get long-term change. Observe, firstly, by their own weighing, if we can prove a concrete benefit to a large number of queer people, then we probably win this debate. I'm going to tell you how we did that in a minute. But secondly, the debate is now about who made up their mile quicker. 2 questions then. Who helped queer people now? Who helped queer people in the long term? Firstly, who helped queer people now? They say that people get a bunch of concrete benefits from live music. A couple of things. Firstly, we just tell you, this is literally a tiny group of people because live music was wildly inaccessible, especially for likely impoverished queer people in a lot of the countries we were talking about. But secondly, you have to weigh this against the risk that is incurred by attending Side Negative's now queerified tour, where Taylor Swift plasters all of her promotion material in pride flags and makes a bunch of really public donations where she calls out the political party that the majority of the country supported. The reason that meant there was a heightened risk of violence, which celebrities directly caused through their hypocrisy. Liv tells you, to their laughter, that probably people don't stop and ask you whether they're gay before they bash you when you come out of the thing where they think all the gay people are, because violence does not operate rationally, and people are likely to simply perceive these people as being other, and that is enough to incur a much higher risk of violence, at the point where, by their own logic, celebrities would simply make it more obvious that they care about queer people and that their concert is a safe space for those queer people. Sucks probably when you then walk outside of that safe space and immediately get hate crime. A couple of things here. Then Udai revives this 15-second Met and makes it the case and says, well, they won't build a queer community now. A couple of observations. First of all, following Udai's really fun Wikipedia recap, probably a lot of countries are still totally fine, and most of those countries were some of the richest countries and states in the world, which meant that these artists could very, very easily offset the risk of losing potentially lucrative performance benefits. But secondly, we told you really, really clearly that queerness wasn't geographically distributed because you could still care about and engender relationships with the queer community, even if you didn't go and perform in certain countries. If it was true that you could only engender fans in certain countries, then in countries that you performed in rather, then none of these artists would ever go and perform anywhere apart from the place where they already were, because they wouldn't have been able to build fan bases. Logically, this obviously does not check out. Discredit entirely. Then we tell you that we give these fans validation and visibility that is deepened because stan culture means that their hero validating them means that all of their heroes' followers were likely to also validate them. Their only response is queer people don't care about politics. I care about my own humanity, and I think other queer people probably do as well. Lastly, who improves them in the long term? They say lobbying. We say you can do the lobbying, but now you have millions of followers who are probably likely to donate and lobby with you, who care about you not performing somewhere significantly more than they care about you performing somewhere, because now you are not doing the thing they expected you to do, and are therefore much more interested. For all of those reasons, we were the side that got better queer rights in the long term, got better outcomes on the ground, and fulfilled our obligation.
Okay, this way we'll have three components. First of all, provide two pieces of general feedback to each team. Secondly, it will announce the result. Thirdly, it will explain how the panel arrived at that result. So, on general feedback, there was kind of two things that we all agreed people needed to work on. The first was that people in this debate could do better work to answer the kind of core question that underlies a lot of claims. So people were very happy to do individual lines of rebuttal responses and explain why a claim is defeated, but could have been a lot more efficient in, for example, addressing the idea that, like, most claims are kind of contingent upon one idea. Let's just rebut that idea and explain to the adjudicator how that defeats a whole bunch of other stuff, which would make speeches a lot more efficient. And I think in a above average quality debate with two relatively good teams, there's going to be a lot of content to address, which means that individual one-liner strategies or leaning more towards that is super inefficient and pretty bad. The second thing is that I think people often are in some senses quite uncharitable to what other teams say in this debate, or another way of phrasing that is don't address the core claim that's being made. So for example, there's a discussion in this debate about more media attention or stronger media attention, and people often rebut by explaining that we can also get this, but the real question in the debate is, to what extent is the marginal increase in media attention actually useful in this debate? And addressing questions in that way, I guess getting to the core of the issue, is an easier way to cut through a lot of clashes and issues in the debate. So, with that said, this was a consensus decision that was awarded to the negative team, so congratulations and commiserations. In arriving at that decision, the panel, I guess, broadly considered three things. The first thing we considered is there an obligation to fans? This is proposed by the Affirmative team that describe a series of ways in which artists with a significant queer following have profited off those fans, and therefore by going in and kind of helping the oppressor or not taking as big of a stance as you could, you turn a blind eye to that and you violate that obligation. The negative, I think, have two ways that are fairly successful in dealing with this. The first is to dispute that this obligation exists in the first instance by pointing out that fans have already been compensated by receiving a service. I think the Affirmative team responds to this by explaining that this is, for example, different from other types of services, or they've been explicitly targeted. On the explicitly targeted, I'm unclear as to how that's different from like any other market or business, which is pointed out at third negative. And I also think that perhaps it is a different type of service, but I think this needed a lot more explanation to explain why this establishes such a strong obligation on individuals. But I think the second way that the negative team is able to deal with this principle is to kind of co-opt the reasoning that the Affirmative team gives on how it should be satisfied, because as I understand it, the claim from the Affirmative team is that you can satisfy this principle by helping individuals significantly, and at the point at which negative suggests that they can also perhaps help individuals more, it would seem to suggest they have an indirect way to satisfy this principal burden, which then leads to the next two issues in the debate, which is how does this affect fans and how does this affect the rights of queer individuals in these places, queer rights in these places, sorry. So, on how does this affect fans, the affirmative team's claim is, I guess, essentially twofold at this point in the debate. The first is a piece of preemptive mitigation to explain that you can, do a lot of listening on things like Spotify or watch things on YouTube, which means that the benefit of an in-person music event is not substantial. And the second thing is to explain at this point that there's a huge safety risk for a lot of individuals. Starting with, I guess, the safety risk stuff, I think that negative are able to mitigate the extent to which there will be safety issues by explaining that, as I'll address later, there's probably going to be an increased amount of security. But I think the real reason why this is very difficult to weigh in favour of the affirmative team is that I'm just convinced, particularly by the responses that come out at second negative, which explain that people already have to go to a lot of similar places like nightclubs where they have to weigh up this issue. People, there might be a lot of media generation, things they can read. This is like a concrete harm and people can weigh off, for example, the differences. Just convinced me that the small risk of violence is not something that should outweigh potentially a quite large benefit to people's experiences in the long term. And I guess now addressing the piece of mitigation, which is you can listen to things online, we'll now discuss what the negative team says here, which is that this is a valuable experience for people who go to these performances. The negative team do two things here. The first thing they do is describe why it's difficult to get this benefit elsewhere, and the second thing they do is then impact that benefit. So, on why this is difficult to get elsewhere, they describe that it's very difficult, for example, to travel and seek out these performances elsewhere, and that you often have a specific attachment to that artist, which means just seeing live music in general does not create the same effect. The affirmative response here is to say it's possible that people can travel when they get older or see these performances elsewhere. I think this is a piece of mitigation, but is not super successful for the reason that I'm unclear as to whether this applies to the majority of people, and as is agreed in the debate, a large part of the countries we're talking about are developing world ones where people don't have the financial ability to do that. So I don't think in the majority of circumstances this mitigation is efficient. Then I think the second thing the affirmative team does here is kind of describe that you can listen on Spotify and live music, I guess, isn't particularly a big benefit in this debate because they weigh it against a lot of their safety harms. I think the previous reasoning to explain why I don't value that claim very highly explains why the weighing attempt here isn't super successful. And then when I compare that to the ways in which negative, impact and weigh their material, I think negative are able to come out by explaining that this often is something that people have a revealed preference to engage in. They're spending thousands of dollars, they're allocating their finances in a way that allow them to do this and are sacrificing a whole bunch of other stuff. Also, just because it means that people can actually form quite meaningful relationships, people have probably admired them for a substantial period of time. I know that the affirmative says that, well, this is a short-term benefit. I don't think this mitigation is also successful for the reason that affirmative, I think at first negative described that these experiences are formative and often people hold them very dearly into the long term, which means I think they can still claim this benefit into the future. I will note here that there is a issue that is litigated in the late stages of the debate about the extent of representation. The panel agreed that this wasn't particularly influential in this issue, but we'll briefly explain how we saw it. The negative team essentially says that now you ignore clear themes because you can't appeal to the market as much if everyone were to do this. The affirmative says that when you're a starting out artist, you want to get as much traction as possible, so you won't do this metagaming. I think the affirmative team is able to convince me this is true when artists are small, but I think the negative team is able to convince me that when artists are large, which is where the harm applies most disproportionately, artists are to some extent likely to act this way. The extent to which artists will act this way is unclear and so wasn't weighed particularly highly, but does slightly fall to the negative team. Very final issue then, which was how does this affect the queer rights in these places? And I think this is where kind of affirmative is the strongest. They explain that going kind of rainbow washes stuff and makes it much harder to speak out. And secondly, they explain that they will have much stronger media generation because they can take a much more hardline stance. The negative team, I think, has two ways of dealing with this. The first is to describe that by virtue of their setup and also reasoning that they provide later in their case, which is that if you're not there doing the thing, you have less of an impetus to give back, explains why they can get some, benefits more directly through things like funding or donations. And I think then what the debate becomes about is the affirmative team claiming that because they are likely to get more media attention, I should weigh this as an easier way to achieve change than, for example, the more direct routes that negative team provide. I think, as I kind of alluded to in general feedback, the reason why we thought this fell to the negative team is because a lot, firstly, of the purpose of getting media attention is to then get people to do a lot of the things that negative are already doing, which means that on weighing here, if I'm confused as to the extent of media change, the negative team have a more concrete benefit, which makes it more easy to weigh in their favour. But secondly, I will note that while negative gives some pieces of mitigation, like you're on the tour so you have some amount of media coverage, we did ultimately feel that just not going and taking a really big hardline stance probably does generate more attention. The reason why that more attention can't win affirmative debate is because it's unclear why that marginal increase in media attention leads to a set of benefits that can then actually outweigh what's been said. And just mainly because we're unclear as to what that marginality is, we therefore can't weigh in favour of the affirmative team. So for those reasons, we think that the directness of the benefit provided by negative team is successful to win this issue. And then by virtue of what's already been discussed, we saw this as a negative win.